bundle of contradictions. And this is the enigma of John Brown, who caused so much controversy and who may have been the single most important figure in bringing about the Civil War. Brown was certainly one of the most significant figures in American history. Now, some historians say the Civil War did not begin at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. They maintain it began at Harpers Ferry, Virginia on October 16, 1859. And yet, despite all this, John Brown's story has been woefully understated in most American histories. I've asked about a dozen family members and friends if they knew who John Brown was. And with only one exception, they didn't know. They'd heard the song. Most people have heard the song, but they didn't really know who John Brown was or what he did. In one case, the person I asked had never even heard of him. Now, this has been changing in recent years, but I'd venture to say that 9 out of 10 Americans could not tell you who John Brown was. So exactly who was John Brown? And how did John Brown become John Brown? Well, John Brown was unknown nationally until about the last 5 years of his life, and more importantly, until his death. We'll examine his life and death today, and while we're doing that, keep in mind the parallels between what John Brown did and the events of this country on January 6, 2021, and also the parallel between John Brown and the American Revolution. Also keep in mind the age-old phrase, "to the ends justify the means." So let's get started. John Brown was born on May 9, 1800 in this house in Torrington, Connecticut. He was the fourth of 8 children, born to Owen Brown and Ruth Mills Brown. At the age of 8, John Brown lost his mother Ruth, who died in childbirth, and that was not at all uncommon at that time. But this loss was devastating to John. Owen Brown, his father, was a major influence on his son John. Owen was a strict Calvinist who instilled his fundamental religious beliefs into his children. He also gave John his strong work ethic and his disdain for earthly goods. Now, Owen was also an outspoken opponent of slavery. He felt it was a sin against God, and he passed that too on to his son John. Well, at the age of 12, a significant event in John Brown's life solidified his abolitionist feelings. His father needed to drive some cattle to Michigan, and John volunteered for the job. Now, shortly after John's birth, Owen had moved the family to Hudson, Ohio, where he owned a tannery, and he also raised some cattle. So John Brown, at the age of 12, takes the cattle to Michigan, where he stays for a week in the home of a slaveholding U.S. Marshal. John there becomes friends with a slave boy who also lives there. That slave boy is about John's same age, and John is appalled, absolutely appalled at the way the young man is treated. While John is praised by his host, the marshal beat his friend with a shovel. This is from the book Patriotic Treason, John Brown and the Soul of America. The author is Evan Carton. Brown would date his personal abolitionist convictions from this experience, when he stood helpless witness to his host's shovel-wielding assault on his friend, and perceived that skin color alone made the difference between the marshal's extravagant esteem for him and gratuitous brutality toward the at least equally worthy black boy. The horror of slavery, as he felt it then, was that it imposed on the slave a state of orphanhood that really was complete and permanent. Now, at the age of 20, John Brown marries Dianthe Lusk. She's about a year younger than him, and she's also the daughter of his housekeeper. Well, in 1826, they moved to Guy Mills, Pennsylvania, where he builds his own tannery, which you see right here. And this is the beginning, actually, of John Brown's wanderings. He was always restless. He continually moved between the states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York. Well, Brown actually does fairly well running this tannery, but he was not a good businessman at all, and this was just the beginning of his many business failures. In 1832, tragedy strikes John Brown again. His wife Dianthe dies 3 days after giving birth to their 7th child. Brown's a widower now. He's left with his 5 surviving children. He somehow manages, and about a year later, in 1833, he marries 16-year-old Mary Ann Day, who is the sister of his housekeeper. I don't know that Brown had a thing about his housekeepers' families. I think he just came into contact with very few women. He was actually a very shy man, especially around women. Now, he and Mary ended up having 13 children. So John Brown sires 20 children altogether, but only 11 survive into adulthood. Now, as I mentioned, John Brown ends up moving from place to place. He's trying various business ventures, and those include raising cattle, he raises sheep, he goes into the wool business, he does some surveying and land speculation in addition to being a tanner. He fails at all of them. But while he's moving around and trying different ways to support his family, Brown begins to believe that God has a special plan for him. In 1834, we have the first writing of his anti-slavery feelings. This is from the book Midnight Rising, John Brown and the Raid That Sparked the Civil War. The author is Tony Horwitz. The next year, Brown wrote to his brother, "I have been trying to devise some means to do something in a practical way for my fellow men who are in bondage." He told his brother that he wanted to bring a black youth into his household, provide him an education, and above all, try to teach him the fear of God. He also hoped to start a school for blacks. Education, he wrote, would free blacks' minds and encourage Southerners to emancipate their slaves. Well, Brown hasn't yet come to the conclusion that violence is the answer here, but he wants to take some kind of action against slavery. I should also mention here, if you're only going to read one book about John Brown, this is the one I would recommend, Midnight Rising, John Brown and the Raid That Sparked the Civil War by Tony Horwitz. It's listed on the handout you should have, probably right at the top there. In 1837, we have another significant event in John Brown's life. It occurs shortly after the killing of abolitionist newspaper publisher Elijah Lovejoy, which takes place in Alton, Illinois. This is from the book The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom. The author is H.W. Brands. In November 1837, a crowd of slavery defenders attacked the building that housed Lovejoy's press. This time he fought back, opening fire on the attackers. In the exchange that followed, he was killed. The news reached Hudson, Ohio, a short while later. The abolitionists in town could speak of nothing else. The excited discussion spilled over into the Thursday prayer meeting at the Congregational Church Brown attended. He sat in the back of the room saying little, but listening much. Finally, as the meeting drew to a close, he stood up. He raised his right hand, and in a determined tone that stuck in the memory of those present, declared, "Here, before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." John Brown really had a slow evolution to where he became a militant abolitionist, someone who would give his life to end slavery. His first public proclamation here in 1837 was one more step in that evolution. In 1839, Brown commits his family to the fight against slavery. He has his wife and teenage sons take an oath to fight against slavery and to defeat it. Now, the 1840s were not good at all for John Brown. In 1842, he declares bankruptcy in federal court, and in 1843, 4 of his children die of dysentery. In 1844, he moves his family to this house you see right here in Akron, Ohio. And it's here in Akron that Brown gets into the wool business with a partner. And while things start out well, it does go south. Brown travels to Europe to try to save the business, but it also eventually fails. Now, while he's in the middle of all this, Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And Brown becomes even more determined to fight slavery. He and his family are now living in Springfield, Massachusetts, where he organizes a group that he calls the United States League of Gileadites. Now, that name is in reference to Mount Gilead in the Bible. You got to remember that just about everything Brown does, he finds a parallel in the Bible. Now, the purpose of this group is to fight slave catchers and to help fugitive slaves escape to Canada. He recruits 44 people in Springfield, most of them black. So what's John Brown going to do now? He's broke, he has debts, he needs to find some means of supporting his family. Well, Brown hears about a plan from wealthy anti-slavery philanthropist Gerrit Smith. Smith wants to start a farming colony for blacks in upstate New York called North Elba. Well, Brown meets with Smith, and he convinces Smith to let Brown and his family become part of this colony to farm and to help out other families who settle there. So in the early 1850s, John Brown relocates his family once again, this time moving to this farm in North Elba, and this is what the property looks like today. Brown's still traveling quite a bit. He's going from North Elba to Ohio and Massachusetts. He's trying to collect money that's owed to him. He's also trying to put off paying his own debts. Brown appears, though, to be at another dead end here. North Elba is not a good area for farming, and he continues to struggle financially. But in 1854, the federal government takes an action that profoundly affects John Brown and his family. Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's the brainchild of Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, who figures the best way to determine whether these territories should become free states or slave states is to let the settlers there decide by popular vote. What could possibly go wrong? Well, just about everything. The Nebraska Territory really wasn't an issue since it was so far north and the land was not suitable for raising cotton or tobacco, crops that needed a large amount of labor. Now, the Kansas Territory was not suitable either, but it was right next to the slave state of Missouri. And Missouri was bordered by the free states of Illinois and Iowa, and the slave owners in Missouri didn't want to have another free state on their border. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it energized Missourians to recruit fellow slave owners to Kansas. It also at the same time led Northerners, especially new immigrants, to relocate to Kansas to start a new life. Now, among those Northerners who relocate to Kansas are 5 of John Brown's grown sons who moved from Ohio to Kansas in early 1855. Brown at that time decides to stay in North Elba, New York with the rest of his family. Now, one thing I should note here, around this time, John Brown actually travels to this part of the country. He was in northern Illinois several times, Elgin, and also where I'm from now, from Rockford. He actually was coming here to sell some of his cattle. So he was close by this area. Here, though, is where the legend of John Brown really starts. His oldest son, John Brown Jr., writes to him from Kansas. He says that pro-slavery men from Missouri are overrunning the territory and the free state settlers need arms in order to fight back. Well, Brown Sr., who by this time is just starting to form a plan to attack slavery in the southern states, he sees this as an opportunity to take action. He raises money from Garrett Smith and some other anti-slavery Northerners in order to purchase guns and supplies to take to Kansas. Brown arrives there in the fall of 1855, where he joins his sons in the small hamlet of Osawatomie. They survive a cold, rough winter without doing much, but that all changes on May 21st, 1856, when a group of pro-slavery men, many of those men from Missouri, known as the Border Ruffians, they sack the anti-slavery community of Lawrence. Well, this is the beginning of what becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. When John Brown hears of what's happening in Lawrence, he forms a 20-man company that includes his sons. They call themselves the Liberty Guards, and they elect John Brown as their commanding officer, so he now becomes known as Captain John Brown. The problem, though, is that by the time the Liberty Guards arrive in Lawrence, the burning and the looting is over, and the attackers are gone with federal troops in control. So Brown and his men then return to Osawatomie with Brown plotting revenge. He was told that 5 anti-slavery men had died. So John Brown decides that 5 pro-slavery men must also lose their lives. On May 24th, 1856, just 3 days after the attack on Lawrence, John Brown, along with 4 of his sons and 3 others, brutally murder 5 unarmed men whom they believe to be pro-slavery. They are hacked to death. The Potawatomi Massacre marks the beginning of John Brown's notoriety. Now, John Brown orders those killings, but he doesn't physically take part in them. So when he's later confronted with them, he denies that he murdered anyone. Well, this is disingenuous at best. John Brown committed one of the worst atrocities of Bleeding Kansas. On June 2nd, 1856, just 10 days after Potawatomi, Brown and his troops strike again. But 2 of Brown's sons had been captured by pro-slavery militia for their part in the Potawatomi Massacre. So Brown's troops, Brown and his band, they fight, they attack that militia, and even though they're outnumbered, Brown's troops win the fight, which becomes known as the Battle of Blackjack. Now, some historians say that Blackjack marks the actual beginning of the Civil War, since it's the first battle between organized forces over slavery. Now, at the same time when this is going on, John Brown is very careful to keep the northern newspapers informed of his actions. So he starts to become now a national figure, and he is actually feared by the pro-slavery factions in Missouri and Kansas. One other significant note here about John Brown's time in Kansas: on August 29, 1856, his son Frederick is killed by a pro-slavery man in what's known as the Battle of Osawatomie. He won't be the last of Brown's children to die fighting on behalf of his father's missions. Now, with the anti-slavery forces gaining control in Kansas, John Brown has bigger fish to fry. He's formulating his plan to take the anti-slavery fight into the South. He refers to the South at this point as Africa. For the next few years then, John Brown travels between Kansas, the New England states, and Canada. He's hoping to raise men, money, and arms for his attack on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Now, he doesn't really talk about his plan much. It's all pretty much in his head. Well, this is the plan he has. He's conceiving right now. He wants to take a band of men, attack the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, get into the arsenal, take all the guns and arms and ammunition there, and then hightail it back into the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And he figures that when word gets out of what he's doing, all the slaves in that area will flee their masters and join his group in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And then from there, they'll do guerrilla attacks, going farther and farther south, trying to free the slaves until all the slaves are freed. That's, again, the plan that John Brown has in his mind at this point. Well, in March 1858, Brown goes back to New England, where he establishes a group called the Secret Six. And you can see them on your screen there. It's George Stearns, Garrett Smith, Frank Sanborn, T.W. Higginson, Theodore Parker, and Samuel Howe. Out of these six, only two are really wealthy. That was Garrett Smith and George Stearns. Now, Samuel Gridley Howe, who you see at the bottom right there, he's the husband of Julia Ward Howe, who also had a role to play in the remembrance of John Brown, which I'll get to later in this presentation. Well, these six men become the main financial backers of Brown on his plan to attack Harpers Ferry. Though it's interesting, Brown is intentionally vague about what he's going to do when he talks to these six men. And the reason he's vague about it, if it fails, he doesn't want these six to be implicated in what he does, and they could get in trouble. Now, initially, it's also interesting, initially all six of these men raise objections to the plan, but in the end, they end up going along with John Brown. Brown finally convinces them by saying, "If God be with us, who can be against us?" Now, there's no doubt that John Brown was a religious fanatic. In May 1858, Brown goes to Chatham, Ontario in Canada, where he meets the renowned Harriet Tubman. She's one of the leaders of the Underground Railroad, and he convinces Tubman to help him recruit free blacks for his planned assault on Harpers Ferry. And Brown here refers to her as General Tubman. He's Captain Brown, she's General Tubman. He also, at this time, convenes an informal convention to adopt a constitution which will be used for governing his group of guerrilla fighters when they invade the South and hole up in the mountains. He again gives a general outline, but he's kind of vague about his plans for going into what he calls Africa. Brown then returns to Kansas, where his men have been training for their attack on the South, and he leaves with his troops in February 1859. As they go through Missouri, they raid several households, they free 11 slaves and escort them to Detroit, where those former slaves eventually go to freedom in Canada. So Brown is successful in just about everything he does in Kansas. He's now convinced he's invincible and that God is on his side. John Brown is now ready for his invasion of Virginia. On July 3rd, 1859, John Brown rents the Kennedy Farm on the outskirts of Sandy Hook, Maryland. And this is about a mile across the Potomac River from Harpers Ferry in Virginia. And this will serve as Brown's headquarters for the raid. He rents the farm under the alias of Isaac Smith. Well, during the summer months, his men arrive along with his 16-year-old daughter, Annie, and his 17-year-old daughter-in-law, Martha. Now, before he launches his raid, John Brown makes one more attempt to convince renowned abolitionist Frederick Douglass to join his group. Brown had met Douglass several times in the past, and actually both men were really impressed with each other. They meet for the final time on August 19, 1859, in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. This is from Midnight Rising, John Brown and the Raid That Sparked the Civil War by Tony Horwitz. Douglass at once opposed the measure. He argued that opening the campaign with an attack on a federal armory would array the whole country against us, rather than railing Americans to the anti-slavery cause. Douglass raised military objections too, arguing that Brown and his men would be easily surrounded in Harpers Ferry. All his arguments and all his descriptions of the place convinced me that he was going into a perfect steel trap, Douglass wrote, and that once in, he would never get out alive. Frederick Douglass had no idea just how accurate his assessment would be. So Brown then returns to the Kennedy farm, and this sets the stage for one of the most significant events in the history of the United States. I have a video on this from Ken Burns' PBS series, The Civil War. Let's take a look.
On Sunday evening, October 16, 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown led 5 blacks and 13 whites into Harpers Ferry, Virginia. He brought along a wagon load of guns to arm the slaves he was sure would rally to him. Once they had, he planned to lead them southward along the crest of the Appalachians and destroy slavery. Brown was an inept businessman who had failed 20 times in 6 states and defaulted on his debts. Yet he believed himself God's agent on earth. In 1856, at Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, he and his sons had hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death with broadswords, all in the name of defeating Satan and his legions. Brown and his men quietly seized the armory, arsenal, and engine house and took up hostages, including George Washington's great-grandnephew. After that, nothing went right. The first person killed was the town baggage master, a free black. The slaves did not rise up. Angry townspeople did. The first of Brown's followers to fall was Dangerfield Newby, a former slave. Someone in the crowd cut off his ears as souvenirs. On Tuesday morning, federal troops arrived from Washington, led by a U.S. Army Colonel, Robert E. Lee. These men stormed the engine house, and 9 more of Brown's men were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown, severely wounded, was turned over to Virginia to be tried for treason.
Now, it's interesting here. As crazy as this plan was, initially Brown was successful with it. He got into the armory. If he had just left right away, taken the arms and ammunition, he probably would have been okay, at least for the time being. But no. His mistake was he took hostages, and he didn't know what to do with them, so they end up holding up in that federal arsenal. And meanwhile, the townspeople gather around there and trap him in there. Federal troops come. And as you can see, the video shows John Brown's raid was a complete fiasco. But let's take a closer look at the aftermath of the raid. And this is really the key to John Brown. Brown was actually lucky to have survived. He suffered severe wounds from being hacked with a dress sword. It's interesting, had John Brown been killed at Harpers Ferry, he probably would have become a small footnote in American history. Instead, he becomes a national phenomenon. There was outrage against John Brown in the South, as you would expect, but it's also interesting, initially, there was also outrage in the North about what John Brown did. This is from The Zealot and the Emancipator by H.W. Brands. Even the abolitionist press had reservations about Brown. William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator characterized the Harpers Ferry raid as misguided, wild, and apparently insane. Republicans at once took cover. we are damnably exercised about the effect of old Brown's wretched fiasco in Virginia upon the health of the Republican Party, a Chicago Republican wrote to Abraham Lincoln. The old idiot, the quicker they hang him and get him out of the way, the better. Republicans in Chicago were contending that Brown had nothing to do with them. Now, as you can imagine, the reaction in the South was pretty hysterical. There were rumors that Brown had at least 750 men with him when he attacked Harpers Ferry. In fact, he had 18. There were witnesses who claimed they saw hundreds of blacks in the area coming to Brown's aid. There were none. The conductor of the train that had gone through at the time of the raid reported that Brown was expecting a reinforcement of 1,500 men. There were no reinforcements. Many in the South believed that this was only the beginning of a grand northern conspiracy and more raids were coming. It's interesting. We had conspiracy theories then. We have conspiracy theories today. Now, what happened next? It was what really raised up John Brown to immortality. Now, there was some question as to whether Brown would be tried in state or federal court. Virginia Governor Henry Wise took charge. Brown and 4 of his surviving invaders were taken from Harpers Ferry to the county jail in Charlestown, Virginia. Now, here they would stand trial in state court on 3 charges: treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, inciting a slave insurrection, and murder. And it was decided that each defendant would be tried separately, with John Brown going first. Well, Governor Wise wanted a fast trial. He wanted to put all this behind his state as quickly as possible. But it's interesting, while John Brown was in jail, he meets with a number of Virginia officials and newspaper reporters, and he impresses just about everyone, even his enemies. He takes full responsibility for what happened. He doesn't deny anything, and he refuses to divulge the names of anyone in the North who had helped him. Now, what happened, though, in the papers he left in the Kennedy farmhouse, which was his headquarters for the raid, the names of the Secret Six and Frederick Douglass were listed. Now, 3 of the 6, the Secret Six, they flee to Canada when they realize what's going on here. And Frederick, also fleeing to Canada, was Frederick Douglass, and Douglass then goes on to Europe. Theodore Parker, one of the 6, is in Rome. He's dying of tuberculosis. And Garrett Smith has a nervous breakdown. He winds up in an insane asylum in Utica, New York. The only one who actually stands his ground and publicly supports Brown is Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was never apprehended or charged. Now, the trial of John Brown begins on October 27th, just 9 days after he and his men are captured. And you have to understand that the trial of John Brown was a national sensation. Additional telegraph wires had to be hung in Charlestown in order to accommodate all the newspaper reporters who literally came from all over the country to cover this. This would really become the trial of the century. I'd actually compare it to O.J. Simpson's trial in terms of capturing the nation's attention. Now, Brown at this time is still recuperating from his wounds. He lies on a cot in the courtroom throughout most of the trial. You can see in this sketch here, he's at the bottom there, lying in that cot. Now, during the proceedings, an attempt is also made for Brown to plead insanity, and he absolutely refuses to do so. There are also plans to attempt a rescue, but Brown again refuses to take part. He had made a promise to his jailer, John Avis, that he would not attempt to escape. So as a result, Avis allowed him to receive numerous visitors and letters. Again, Brown impresses everyone with his composure and his commitment to what he believes is his religious mission. On November 2nd, 1859, after a trial that lasted only 7 days, the jury finds John Brown guilty on all 3 counts, and Judge Richard Parker asked Brown if he has any final words before sentencing. Brown is not prepared for that at all. He has nothing written down, but he then makes one of the great speeches in American history. This is part of that speech. Had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of their friends, every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. Now, Brown goes on to say, and this is from Midnight Rising by Tony Horwitz, "This court acknowledges too, I suppose, the validity of the law of God. That teaches me that all things whatsoever I would men should do to me, I should do ever so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them." He had abided by the golden rule and the scriptural injunction to care for the afflicted. This brought Brown to the climax of his speech, in effect to the climax of his long struggle against slavery. "Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." Well, Judge Parker then sentences Brown to be hanged by the neck until you are dead. He sets December 2nd, exactly 1 month later, for the execution. Big mistake if you're a supporter of slavery. Now, because the trial was conducted so quickly, Judge Parker felt that extra time should be given for any appeals that might be made, and also to avoid any accusations that he wasn't being fair. But in that 30 days, John Brown becomes a martyr to the North. What you see here is a handbill posted in New Hampshire just 2 days after Brown's verdict and sentencing, and it reads as follows: "Treason. All true Christians who believe in immortality through Jesus Christ alone are requested to pray for Captain John Brown, who now is under sentence of death and is to be hung next month for righteousness' sake, in doing justly with his fellow man, his country, and his God, by request of one who loves the truth and feels for the man that is to die a martyr to it." We can see Brown's final speech at his trial had a tremendous impact. This is from the book Battle Cry of Freedom, the Civil War Era. The author is James McPherson. "These words moved Theodore Parker, the Unitarian minister and member of the Secret Six, to pronounce Brown not only a martyr, but also a saint. They inspired Ralph Waldo Emerson to prophesy that the old warrior would make the gallows as glorious as the cross." Emerson was actually very important in turning Northern opinion around on John Brown, and really, as you can see, in glorifying him. This is from Midnight Rising by Tony Horwitz. "Ralph Waldo Emerson, the most eminent intellectual of his day, hailed Brown's speech as one of the finest in history, and he would later call it and the Gettysburg Address the two best specimens of eloquence we have had in this country. This praise reflected the strong shift in Northern opinion that occurred following Brown's conviction and sentencing. Emerson, like others, had initially viewed Harpers Ferry with horror, writing that Brown lost his head and committed a fatal blunder in attacking Virginia. Now, moved by Brown's words and those of his neighbor Henry David Thoreau, Emerson reconsidered his earlier stance and became one of the abolitionists' greatest champions." But John Brown not only accepted his fate here, he understood that he was worth more to his cause dead than alive. Now, while awaiting his execution, Brown wrote of being on a mission from God, and he actually compared himself to Jesus Christ. This is from Midnight Rising by Tony Horwitz. "Jesus of Nazareth suffered a most excruciating death on the cross as a felon," he wrote his family. "Think also of the prophets and apostles and Christians of former days, who went through greater tribulations than you and I. His sacrifice," Brown added, "will do vastly more toward advancing the cause I have earnestly endeavored to promote than all I have done in my life before." Or, as he put it plainly to his brother, "I am worth inconceivably more to hang than for any other purpose." But John Brown still captured the nation's attention, and Virginia officials actually worried that there might be a last-minute rescue attempt at his hanging. What you see here is a broadside posted by the mayor of Charlestown. It's warning all the local citizens to stay away from the execution. Now, despite Brown having numerous visitors in jail while he was awaiting his execution, one person he told not to come was his wife, Mary. And Brown worried that Mary would be subjected to all kinds of harassment, and Brown didn't want to lose his commitment to his fate. But shortly before his scheduled hanging, Brown changes his mind, and Mary did visit him on December 1st, the day before his hanging. Now, one consequence of Mary's visit was Governor Wise of Virginia allowed her to take John Brown's body back to North Elba, New York for burial, and that's where it lies today. December 2nd, 1859. John Brown is led from his jail cell to a scaffold that had been erected exclusively for his execution. On the way, John Brown hands a jail guard a scrap of paper on which he wrote the following: I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. Well, here, John Brown is really predicting the coming Civil War, and in the end, it's something he wanted to see happen. Now, there are hundreds of soldiers surrounding the scaffold. No one but government officials and those with influence could get anywhere near it. Brown quietly, without any protest, climbs up the stairs, and he only asks that they get this over with as quickly as possible. Without any other comment, the trapdoor opens, and in a few minutes, John Brown is dead. One side note here, and I find this pretty amazing. The execution of John Brown was attended by Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, and John Wilkes Booth, all playing major roles, as you know, in the Civil War and its aftermath. Well, this is the physical end of John Brown, but certainly not the end of his influence. At his execution, church bells rang on the north, there were prayer meetings and speeches. This is from Midnight Rising by Tony Horwitz. In Ohio, Akron businesses shut, and Clevelanders hung the streets of their city in crepe. In Hartford, a Statue of Liberty atop the State House dome was draped in black. In Boston, 4,000 people packed the Tremont Temple to honor Brown. Among the eulogies they heard was one by William Lloyd Garrison that showed how much the ground had shifted, even beneath those who had long opposed violence. I am a non-resistant, Garrison reminded his audience, yet as a peaceman, I am prepared to say success to every slave insurrection at the South and in every slave country. Now, as you can imagine, the South didn't react in quite the same way with all of this. Southerners were horrified, absolutely horrified, not only by the Harpers Ferry raid, they were also horrified about Northern reaction to it and to John Brown's hanging. And this is from Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. They only saw that millions of Yankees seemed to approve of a murderer who tried to set the slaves at their throats. The North has sanctioned and applauded theft, murder, and treason, cried DeBoe's review. Could the South afford any longer to live under a government, the majority of whose subjects of citizens regard John Brown as a martyr and a Christian hero? Asked a Baltimore newspaper. The Harpers Ferry invasion has advanced the cause of disunion more than any event that has happened since the formation of the government, agreed two rival Richmond newspapers. Thousands of men who a month ago scoffed at the idea of a dissolution of the Union now hold the opinion that its days are numbered. On the Senate floor, Robert Toombs of Georgia warned that the South would never permit this federal government to pass into the traitorous hands of the Black Republican Party. Defend yourselves, Toombs thundered to the Southern people. The enemy is at your door. Wait not to meet him at your hearthstone. Meet him at the doorsill and drive him from the Temple of Liberty. The die was cast. From this point on, and this is significant because of what John Brown did, from this point on, the South started to seriously arm itself in preparation for war. Before John Brown's raid, the South, they obviously didn't get along with the North, with the anti-slavery people, but they felt the North was a lot of talk. They wouldn't take action. This changed then with John Brown, and that's when the South said, wait a minute here, we've got to take this seriously and take some action here. In 1860, Jefferson Davis was a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, and he was one of 3 senators on a committee investigating the raid on Harpers Ferry. Now, the committee report condemned the raid, and it warned that there's no guarantee of future peace between the North and the South. This is from The Zealot and the Emancipator by H.W. Brands. Jefferson Davis sponsored a resolution affording the South protection against other Browns. the Senate approved Davis's resolution, albeit on a party line vote, with Democrats in favor and Republicans against or abstaining. We had a strict party line vote then, we have strict party line votes today. Now, Brands goes on to say, the failure of the party of Lincoln, who had just won the Republican nomination, to support the resolution disposed Davis to doubt the Republicans' devotion to constitutional principles. He subsequently refused to believe Lincoln's claims as candidate and then as president that he had no designs against slavery in the states. Now, Jefferson's beliefs really mirrored those throughout the South, and the presidential election of 1860 ends up becoming a referendum on secession. If Lincoln won, most of the slave states would leave the Union and the Civil War would begin. This, however, is not the end of the legacy of John Brown. Early in the war, in 1861, the 2nd Massachusetts Battalion came up with new lyrics to a familiar song. This again from H.W. Brands. A favorite from revivals was a tune called "Say Brothers, Will You Meet Us?" As it happened, one of the battalion members was a fun-loving Scotsman, also named John Brown. At some point, one of the teasers, to emphasize that his John Brown couldn't be the other, declared, "Yes, yes, poor old John Brown is dead. His body lies moldering in the grave." Well, it wasn't before long that one of the songsters matched the John Brown line to the Say Brothers tune. And as they say, the rest is history. The 2nd Massachusetts would sing the song as they marched. They would also sing it for visitors at Fort Warren. And eventually the song was published, as you can see right here. I have a video of John Brown's body. It's sung by Gloria Jane. Let's take a look at part of it.
Harpers Ferry with his 19 men so few, and he frightened over Jenny till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves a traitorous crew, but his truth still marches on. He's gone to be a soldier in the army of the Lord. He's gone to be a soldier in the army of the Lord. He's gone to be a soldier in the army of the Lord, and his truth still marches on. John Brown was John the Baptist, for the Christ we are to see. Christ of whom the bondsman shall the liberator be. And soon throughout the sunny south, the slaves were all set free, and his truth went marching on.
Now, there are actually several more verses to this song, but we only have so much time here today. Also, when you hear the song over and over, especially with the chorus there, you can't get out of your head, and I don't want that to happen to everybody here today. Now, this song becomes extremely popular, but it then gets transformed into something much bigger. The anthem of the North during the Civil War, and the person who does that transformation is one Julia Ward Howe, who's the wife of Samuel Gridley Howe, one of John Brown's Secret Six. Here's the story of Battle Hymn of the Republic as told by Ken Burns in the PBS series the Civil War.
At the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., the poet Julia Ward Howe awoke from a spectacular dream. That day, she had heard a New England regiment singing on parade and had fallen asleep with the song, John Brown's Body, ringing in her head. Now, in the dark, she got up and scribbled out the words with a pencil stub. She sold her poem to the Atlantic Monthly for $4. It became the anthem of the Union.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on.
So now we're back to our original questions. Was John Brown a hero or a terrorist? Was he a martyr or a madman? Let's take a look at what some modern historians have to say. This is from Eric Foner in the London Review of Books. Today, Lincoln is widely revered, while many Americans, including some historians, consider Brown mad. Yet it was Brown's strategy that brought slavery to an end. From Harvard historian John Stauffer in the Smithsonian Magazine. Brown was thought mad because he crossed the line of permissible dissent. He was willing to sacrifice his life for the cause of blacks, and for this, in a culture that was simply marinated in racism, he was called mad. From James McPherson from his book, This Mighty Scourge, Perspectives on the Civil War. I tend to look upon John Brown more as a freedom fighter than as a terrorist, recognizing, however, that there is sometimes a thin to non-existent line between them. John Brown's goals were noble, but his means were not always praiseworthy. From Oswald Garrison Viard from his book, John Brown, 1800 to 1859, a biography after 50 years. This book came out in 1910, and Oswald Garrison Viard is the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison. Viard writes, "There are those in the 20th century appointed to teach history in high places who were so blind as to see in John Brown only the murderer of the Potawatomi, a horse thief, and midnight assassin. Still others behold him not only a sainted martyr of the most elevated character, but the liberator of Kansas, and the man who, unaided, struck their chains from the limbs of more than 3 million human beings. The truth lies somewhere between these two extremes." From Evan Carton, from his book, Patriotic Treason, John Brown and the Soul of America. Had John Brown been an escaped slave, or a free northern black man who acted and spoke exactly as the historical John Brown did, professional historians of the last 50 years would not have labeled him mad. Radical, militant, enraged, desperate, impatient, self-aggrandizing perhaps, but not crazy. A man who lived, went to war, and died to help win black people's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness must have been black. A white man who did these things must have been deranged or fanatical. It's interesting. Before I read that, I had never even thought about that. What if John Brown were black? Would we have a different view of him today? Another interesting perspective. This is from City University of New York historian David Reynolds, quoted in the Smithsonian Magazine. Had John Brown's raid not occurred, it is very possible that the 1860 election would have been a regular two-party contest between anti-slavery Republicans and pro-slavery Democrats. Democrats probably would have won, since Lincoln received just 40% of the popular vote, around 1 million votes less than his three opponents. Because Brown helped disrupt the party system, Lincoln was carried to victory, which in turn led 11 states to secede from the Union. This in turn led to the Civil War. Imagine that. Without John Brown, it's possible that Abraham Lincoln does not get elected president in 1860, or perhaps never. Again, there were 4 candidates altogether for that presidential election in 1860. 2 of them were Democrats, and those 2 Democrats actually got more popular votes than Abraham Lincoln did. Now, I'm becoming increasingly convinced that without John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry, the Civil War does not begin in 1861. Probably later, but not in 1861. Well, that concludes my formal presentation here today, but I want to bring up a couple of things that I said at the outset. Consider the parallels between what John Brown did and the events in this country on January 6, 2021, and also the parallels between John Brown and the American Revolution. In all of those cases, people or individuals took violent action against something they thought was wrong. They felt very right in their convictions. They were simply trying to right a wrong. Also, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, consider that phrase, do the ends justify the means? And that's a critical thing with John Brown, certainly. And I also want to ask you now, after this presentation, your opinion, to ask that question about John Brown. How many here think John Brown was a hero? Raise your hand. How many think he was a terrorist? Raise your hand. How many think he was a martyr? Raise your hand. And how many think he was a madman? Raise your hand. And how many think he was all four? Raise your hand. And I would agree with that. I think John Brown was all four of those things. Quite a complex character, to say the least, in American history. And I think we have time, I hope now, and any questions or comments someone may have. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us how the mural ended up in the Kansas Capitol?
You know, I don't know the exact story of that. No, that's a good point, though. It's in the capital of Kansas, and obviously that was from all the events that went on in Kansas with Bleeding Kansas and everything.
So I'm wondering how the people of Kansas felt about it.
I'm sure it was controversial, to say the least, and I'm sure people in the South didn't appreciate the fact that that would have been in the state capital of Kansas in Topeka. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Was there a strategic reason why he picked Harpers Ferry?
Only that, it was a federal arsenal. He wanted to do something to go against the federal government, and I think that he kind of came upon that. And also it was farther north, so he wanted to attack someplace in the south. Part of his plan was that the slaves in the area, to join his forces. And so it was just probably more convenient than anything else. And keep in mind, too, at that time, Harpers Ferry, today it's part of West Virginia. At that time, it was part of Virginia. And that's also, just an aside, I find that fascinating. When I took American history, they never taught me this in high school, how West Virginia became a state. Most of you may know this. If you don't, Virginia secedes from the Union. That area in West Virginia is all part of that, but those counties in the northwest part of the state, very mountainous. And so as a result, they couldn't grow cotton or tobacco, so they had very little use for slaves. And they end up, after Virginia secedes, they then secede from Virginia and become part of the Union as the state of West Virginia. Yeah?
Why do you feel like the slave support did not occur around that?
I think a number of reasons. Number one, the slaves, they didn't know who John Brown was. I mean, they had no idea about that. Secondly, those that would have found out, they're mad. How would they find out, especially that night, unless they had been prepared for the raid beforehand, and which they weren't. Now, there wasn't word spreading that, oh, we're about to get raided here or anything. So I don't know how Brown in his mind, in this area, his plan was pretty crazy. He had no plan on how the slaves are going to find out about what he did. And if you again study that history and everything, slaveholders at that time, they gave almost no information to their slaves about what was the abolitionist movement that was going on in the North. Matter of fact, I believe it was in the 1830s, a lot of the states passed laws which made it illegal for mail and any kind of documents to come from the North that advocated against slavery. So it would have been very difficult for the slaves to find out that. The other thing about that, too, there were relatively few slaves in that area around Harpers Ferry. Again, that was kind of a mountainous area. They didn't have very many slaves. I don't know what he thought in his mind was going to happen with that. Another theory, though, that I found interesting is the theory that John Brown actually wanted to fail in what he did. In his mind, he's, I'll fail in this. They'll try me, they'll execute me, and I'll become a martyr for the cause. Again, that's just a theory. Brown never actually wrote about that or apparently said that to anybody. Yeah, yes.
Did I misunderstand in reference to Mr. Brown participating in the murders of the 5 men?
Yeah.
Did you say that he didn't actually participate, that he ordered
He ordered it.
Because in the trial, it said that he was found guilty of murder.
Right. Well, he ordered it.
By ordering.
But, exactly. But that's why.
Actually physically killing.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. And you know, and that's why I said he could tell people, well, I didn't kill anybody. Well, in essence, he really did. He ordered, you know, and his sons were part of that too. Yeah.
Did Abraham Lincoln ever comment or write about him?
Yeah, he did. I mean, initially Lincoln was just thought it was terrible what John Brown did at Harpers Ferry. He thought that was a terrible thing that went on there. You know, he again. It's funny. Lincoln, in Lincoln's mind, Lincoln didn't think there was going to be a war over this, at least not at that point. And he thought what Brown did, he thought it was terrible. He had a very low opinion of John Brown. Initially, I'm not sure how he felt later on, but initially, yeah. He was actually with a lot of Northerners who felt this was actually going to hurt the anti-slavery cause. Yeah, yes, sir.
He had brothers and sisters. Were they involved or knew what was going on?
You say his brothers and sisters. Not that I'm aware of at this point. You know, obviously his children were. But brothers and sisters, I don't know. You know, and the stuff I've read, there really isn't much comment. Again, at one point he wrote to a brother about his mission when he was captured, but nothing about them, you know, coming to his aid or anything like that. The other thing that's interesting is, you know, he had 11. He sired 20 children. 11 lived to adulthood. There are a lot of his descendants living today. And they have an annual convention, they have an annual meeting of all his descendants who are alive today. I know sometimes it's in North Elba, I'm not sure where else, but it's quite a big gathering apparently.
That's where Columbus ski slopes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that there's a theory that... Thank you so much, Bob.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your time and attention.